Good evening and welcome, sleepy viewer. Please take this time to try and find a quiet corner of the world, a moment of stillness away from the rush of the present. Do let me know in the comments below where in the world you are tuning in from and what time it shows on your clock. I always love reading them as it makes us all interconnected. As tonight, we are about to travel back in time, not to a gilded throne room filled with cheering crowds, nor to a blood-soaked battlefield ringing with the clash of steel. Our journey today takes us to a much smaller, far more secret place. We are going into the innermost sanctum of the royal court, a small, private chamber where the most powerful man in the kingdom was at his most vulnerable. We are going to explore a royal position so strange, so intimate, and so viscerally shocking to our modern sensibilities that its very name sounds like a vulgar joke. And yet, the man who held this title was no fool. He was one of the most envied, most feared, and most influential figures in the land. This is the story of the Groom of the Stool, a story that reveals that the true nature of power lies not always in the public pronouncement, but in the private whisper, and that the path to greatness could sometimes lead through the king's privy chamber. To understand the sheer, mind-bending weirdness of this role, we must first strip away our modern understanding of privacy and the human body. We must immerse ourselves in the world of the late medieval and Tudor court, a world governed by a profoundly different set of rules. In this world, the king was not merely a head of state or a chief executive. He was a semi-divine figure, a man chosen by God to rule, his body a sacred vessel. This concept, known to scholars as the king's two bodies, was the central pillar of monarchical ideology. The king had a body natural, the mortal physical flesh that was subject to sickness, hunger, and decay, just like any other man. But he also possessed a body politic, an immortal, mystical body that represented the enduring, indivisible sovereignty of the kingdom itself. This body politic could never die, never err, never be weak. The king was therefore a living paradox, a mortal man who was also the embodiment of an immortal idea. Because of this dual nature, every aspect of the king's body natural was imbued with the sacred importance of his body politic. His physical existence was not his own. It was a public performance, a series of rituals that affirmed his unique status and the divine order of the universe. The king did not simply wake up in the morning, he participated in the levee, a formal ceremony where high-ranking nobles were granted the immense honor of watching him emerge from sleep, wash his hands, and put on his first layer of clothing. He did not simply eat a meal, he dined in public, with courtiers standing in silent, reverent attendance. Each morsel he consumed a symbol of the kingdom's prosperity. Every stage of his life, from his birth to his marriage to his death, was a public spectacle, a piece of state theater in which the entire nation was an audience. In a world where the king's every public act was a ritual, it stands to reason that his most private, most human, most universal bodily functions would also be subject to a unique and extraordinary level of formal management. And it is here, in this intersection of the sacred and the profane, of the divine right of kings and the inescapable reality of human biology, that the role of the Groom of the Stool was born. The title itself is a source of endless fascination and misunderstanding. Let us break it down. The word groom in the 15th and 16th centuries did not primarily mean a stable boy. It signified a trusted servant of high standing, a caretaker. A groom was an attendant, a manager, a senior official within the royal household's hierarchy. It was a title of responsibility. The second part of the title, the stool, is where the visceral shock lies. The word had a starkly dual meaning. First, and most literally, it referred to the piece of furniture itself, the close stool. This was not a crude bucket in a drafty outhouse. The king's close stool was a portable, throne-like toilet, a masterpiece of craftsmanship. It was a wooden box, often elaborately carved and upholstered in the finest velvet and silk, decorated with ribbons and gold-headed nails. Concealed within this ornate chair was a pewter or ceramic bowl, the receptacle. The entire apparatus was a symbol of status, a private throne for the king's most private business. But stool also carried the medical, biological meaning that is so familiar to us today. It was a direct, unflinching term for the king's own excrement. Therefore, the title Groom of the Stool meant, in the most literal and unavoidable sense, the attendant of the king's feces. His primary foundational duty was to attend to the king during the act of defecation. He was responsible for maintaining the close stool, for ensuring its cleanliness and readiness. He would provide the bowl, assist the king as needed, and, when the royal business was concluded, he would be responsible for removing the bowl, cleaning it, and providing the king with water and a linen towel for washing. He was the man who literally handled the king's shit. To our modern minds, this sounds like the most degrading, humiliating, and foul job imaginable. We envision a servant of the lowest possible status, a menial cleaner, a royal janitor. But to think this way is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of power in the Tudor court. In the claustrophobic, paranoid, and intensely personal world of the royal household, power was not measured in titles or in wealth, though those were its rewards. Power was measured in a single, simple currency: proximity, access. The ability to get close to the king, to speak to him when others could not, to be with him in his unguarded moments was the most valuable political commodity in the kingdom. And who was closer to the king, more consistently and in a more private setting, than the man who attended him on his close stool? This is the central, shocking paradox of the groom of the stool. A role that seems, on the surface, to be the most menial and abject in the entire court was, in reality, one of the most powerful and sought-after positions a man could hope to attain. The groom of the stool was not a lowly servant. From its very inception in the reign of King Henry VII, the role was exclusively reserved for men of high birth. They were the sons of noblemen, knights, and prominent gentry. They were well-educated, ambitious, and politically astute. They were chosen for this role not because they were good at cleaning, but because they possessed the ultimate qualification: the king's absolute personal trust. The groom's power stemmed from the unique intimacy of his position. He was the gatekeeper to the king's most private self. While the great dukes and cardinals had to jostle for position in the crowded presence chamber, hoping for a brief word with the monarch, the groom of the stool was with the king daily in the quiet seclusion of the privy chamber. This was the king's private apartment, his inner sanctum, and within the privy chamber, the most secluded space of all was the small closet or study where the close stool was kept. Here, with his breeches down and his crown and robes of state set aside, the king was at his most human, his most vulnerable. He was not the body politic, the immortal symbol of England. He was simply the body natural, a man on a toilet. In these moments, stripped of the theatre of monarchy, the king would talk. He would speak not as a king to a subject, but as a man to a trusted companion. The groom of the stool became the repository of the king's private thoughts, his secret fears, his unguarded opinions. He heard the king complain about his ministers, grumble about his wife, and express doubts about a course of action. He saw the king in pain, in frustration, and in moments of weakness. This knowledge was power. The groom knew the king's moods better than anyone. He knew when to press a point and when to remain silent. He knew who was in favor and who was on the way out. He became the king's confidant, his personal secretary, and, in many ways, his closest friend. This role as confidant naturally evolved into a role as a political influencer. Courtiers quickly learned that the fastest way to get a message to the king, or to subtly poison him against a rival, was not through the formal channels of the council, but through the informal channel of the groom of the stool. A powerful nobleman like the Duke of Norfolk might slip the groom a purse of gold and ask him to mention, at an opportune moment, the loyalty and good service of a particular nephew. An ambassador might cultivate the groom's friendship, hoping to get a clearer sense of the king's true intentions on a matter of foreign policy. The groom became a conduit, a gatekeeper who could control the flow of information to the monarch in his most receptive moments. He could pass along a petition, subtly advocate for a friend, or cast a seed of doubt about an enemy. His influence was quiet, subtle, and immense. Furthermore, the groom's duties quickly expanded far beyond the close stool itself. Because he was so trusted and so constantly in the king's presence, he became the de facto manager of the king's private life. He became the chief gentleman of the privy chamber, the inner sanctum of the court. He was responsible for monitoring access to the king, for helping him dress and undress, and for serving his food and drink in private. He held the keys to the king's private apartments. He was also responsible for the king's privy purse, the monarch's personal cash fund, separate from the national treasury. This made him the king's personal banker. He handled vast sums of money, paying the king's gambling debts, purchasing his private gifts, and dispensing cash for his daily expenses. This financial power made him a crucial figure for anyone seeking royal favor or patronage. To be the groom of the stool was to be the king's shadow, his personal assistant, his chief of staff, and his closest companion, all rolled into one. The terror mentioned in the title of this exploration was therefore twofold. First, there was the visceral, almost primal terror that the job itself inspires in us. It is the terror of the abject, the fear of the unclean, the modern revulsion at the idea of such intimate, unsanitized contact with the body of another. We live in a world of flush toilets and deodorized privacy, and the stark physicality of the groom's role is a jarring reminder of a far less squeamish age. It forces us to confront the biological reality of even the most powerful figures, a reality that our own culture tries so hard to conceal. But the more potent and more historically significant terror was the political terror that the groom of the stool inspired in his contemporaries. For the ambitious courtier, the powerful minister, or the plotting nobleman, the groom was a figure of immense and terrifying power. He was the man who could block your access to the king. He was the whisper in the king's ear that could ruin your career or even cost you your life. He was the silent observer who witnessed every private moment, who knew every secret, and whose loyalty was, first and foremost, to the king alone. In the high-stakes, zero-sum game of the Tudor court, where a single misstep could lead to the Tower of London and the executioner's block, the groom of the stool was a man to be feared and respected in equal measure. He was the gatekeeper of the ultimate source of all power, and his seemingly foul and degrading job was, in fact, the very key to his ascendancy. The terror he inspired was the terror of the unknown, the fear of what was being said in that small private room, and the chilling realization that the fate of the kingdom could be influenced by a conversation that took place while the king was sitting on his velvet-upholstered toilet. The man who handled the king's most private waste held a form of power that was anything but disposable. He was at the very heart of the monarchy, a living testament to the fact that in a world of absolute power, the greatest influence belonged to the person who was privy to the king's most profound and inescapable humanity. The story of the groom of the stool is not a timeless one, a role that existed from the moment an English king first sat on a throne. It is a specific, peculiar, and uniquely modern invention, a creature of a new age forged in the fires of England's most vicious and psychologically scarring civil war. To comprehend its genesis, we must first step back from the office itself and survey the blood-soaked landscape from which it grew. We must understand the profound trauma of the Wars of the Roses and the character of the cold, calculating monarch who survived them. The role, in its formal and powerful incarnation, was born with the Tudor dynasty, conceived by a usurper king, and brought to its terrifying and magnificent maturity under his son, the great tyrant Henry VIII. It was a Tudor invention, and its story is the story of a new kind of power. One built not on the loyalties of feudal armies, but on the treacherous and shifting sands of personal intimacy. Before Henry Tudor, England had bled for 30 years. The Wars of the Roses, that poetic name for a brutal, chaotic, and dynastic blood feud between the rival branches of the Plantagenet royal house, the House of Lancaster, symbolized by the red rose, and the House of York, symbolized by the white, had been a catastrophe for the old order. It was not a war of ideologies or nations, but a savage, internecine struggle for the crown itself, a conflict fueled by ambition, revenge, and the fatal weakness of a saintly but utterly inept Lancastrian king, Henry VI. His periodic bouts of catatonic insanity created a power vacuum at the heart of the kingdom, a vacuum that the powerful and ambitious magnates of the realm were all too eager to fill. The concept of the overmighty subject, a nobleman like Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker, became a terrifying reality. These were men whose personal wealth, vast landholdings, and private armies of liveried retainers allowed them to challenge the authority of the crown itself. They made and unmade kings, their loyalties shifting with the political winds, their private feuds escalating into national battles. The violence was intimate and shocking. The Battle of Towton in 1461, fought in a blinding snowstorm, is still considered the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil, a single day of slaughter that saw a significant portion of the English nobility hacked to pieces. Kings were not just defeated, they were humiliated, deposed, and murdered. The pious Henry VI was imprisoned in the Tower of London, paraded through the streets by his rivals, and eventually, it is almost certain, murdered in his cell, his death conveniently announced as a result of pure displeasure and melancholy. His son and heir, Edward of Westminster, was killed in the aftermath of the Battle of Tewkesbury, possibly executed in cold blood after being taken prisoner. The sanctity of the royal person, the divine mystique that was supposed to set the king apart from other men, was shattered. The crown had become a spoil of war, a prize to be won by the man with the largest army and the most ruthless ambition. The Yorkist king, Edward IV, who seized the throne in 1461, was a formidable warrior, handsome, charismatic, and ruthless. But even he could not fully tame the beast of aristocratic factionalism. He was briefly deposed by his own kingmaker, the Earl of Warwick, and his own brother, the Duke of Clarence, conspired against him, a betrayal for which he was eventually executed, famously, though perhaps apocryphally, by being drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. When Edward IV died suddenly in 1483, the kingdom was plunged back into chaos. His brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power, declared Edward's sons illegitimate, and had them imprisoned in the Tower of London. These two boys, the princes in the Tower, vanished from history, almost certainly murdered on the orders of the man who then crowned himself King Richard III. This was the world that shaped the Tudor monarchy. It was a world of breathtaking betrayal, where even a brother's loyalty could not be trusted. It was a world where the greatest nobles of the land felt entitled to challenge the king, and where the king's own private chambers were not safe from the assassin's knife. It was this atmosphere of deep-seated paranoia, this legacy of blood and treachery, that formed the political DNA of the man who would finally end the wars, Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Henry's claim to the throne was, by any objective measure, laughably weak. It came through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, a descendant of John of Gaunt, but through a line that had been born illegitimate and later legitimised by an Act of Parliament that specifically barred them from inheriting the throne. He was a Welshman, an outsider who had spent most of his youth in exile in Brittany, living as a political pawn, but he was the last best hope of the Lancastrian faction. With a small army funded by the King of France, who was happy to destabilise his English rival, Henry landed in Wales in 1485. He marched through the country, gathering support until he met the forces of King Richard III at Bosworth Field. In a battle decided by the last-minute betrayal of the Stanley family, who turned their forces against their Yorkist master, Richard III was killed, and the crown of England was reputedly found hanging on a hawthorn bush and placed upon Henry Tudor's head. He was now King Henry VII, but Henry knew his throne was built on sand. He was a usurper who had taken the crown by force, just as others had before him. His entire reign was dedicated to a single, overriding objective: securing his dynasty and ensuring that the chaos of the Wars of the Roses would never return. Every policy he enacted can be understood through this lens of profound insecurity. His marriage to Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV, was a brilliant political move, uniting the White Rose and the Red Rose to create the new Tudor dynasty. But he knew that a symbolic marriage was not enough. He was plagued by Yorkist plots and pretenders for years. First came Lambert Simnel, a boy who was passed off as a Yorkist heir and was crowned king in Ireland, a rebellion that Henry had to crush in battle. Then, more seriously, came Perkin Warbeck, a charismatic young Fleming who claimed to be Richard, the younger of the princes in the Tower, and who for years gained support from foreign courts and launched invasions of England. To combat this instability, Henry VII created a new kind of kingship, one based on bureaucratic control, financial solvency, and a ruthless suppression of his rivals. He deliberately avoided expensive foreign wars, which he knew would require him to raise taxes and ask his nobles for military support, thereby increasing their power. Instead, he focused on amassing a vast personal fortune, using harsh and often legally dubious financial instruments like bonds and recognizances to intimidate his nobility and keep them financially dependent upon his goodwill. He created the Court of the Star Chamber to deal with powerful subjects who defied the law. He was a king who ruled not from the saddle, but from the counting house. His power was not in the glamour of his court, but in the meticulous ledgers that detailed the debts and obligations of every great family in his kingdom. Central to this new model of control was the reorganization of the royal household itself. Henry understood from the bloody lessons of the past that the king's personal space had to be an impregnable fortress. He could not afford to be surrounded by the powerful, independent-minded nobles who had toppled his predecessors. He needed to be insulated, protected, and served by men who owed everything to him. He thus began the process of radically empowering the Privy Chamber. While the great public ceremonies of the court continued in the presence chamber, the real business of the kingdom, the true access to the king, was now to be found in his private apartments. The Privy Chamber became a government department in its own right, with its own staff, its own seal, and its own budget. It was the inner sanctum, the political, social, and emotional heart of the Tudor regime. And who would be the master of this secret world? Who would be the chief officer responsible for its security, its staffing, and its finances? This was the role that Henry VII created for his Groom of the Stool. He took the pre-existing, vaguely defined role of a Privy Chamber attendant and formalized it into a position of immense trust and authority. The Groom was to be the king's ultimate bodyguard, not in a military sense, but in a domestic one. He was the gatekeeper. He slept at the foot of the king's bed or in an antechamber. He controlled who was granted the rare privilege of entering the king's private world. He monitored every servant, every visitor, every piece of food that came near the monarch. In a paranoid age of poison and plots, this was a responsibility of staggering importance. The men Henry VII chose for this role were not great lords, but trusted gentlemen from his own household. Men who had often been with him in exile, whose loyalty was proven and absolute. They were his companions, his dressers, his private secretaries, and the guardians of his physical person. Their attendance on him at the closed stool was the ultimate expression of this trust. In that moment of vulnerability, the king was placing his life, quite literally, in his servants' hands. The duty, therefore, far from being degrading, was a mark of the highest possible favor. A daily, tangible symbol of the groom's unique and privileged position. He was the most trusted man in a kingdom run by a king who trusted no one. This model of a withdrawn, secure, and bureaucratically controlled monarchy was utterly transformed by the accession of Henry VII's second son, Henry VIII, in 1509. The new king was everything his father was not. He was young, handsome, a superb athlete, a talented musician, and a scholar of some note. He despised his father's parsimonious, penny-pinching ways and quickly set about spending the vast treasury his father had accumulated. Henry VIII's court was a dazzling spectacle of Renaissance magnificence, designed to awe his subjects and impress his European rivals. It was a world of jousts, masks, elaborate feasts, and extravagant fashions. But beneath this glittering facade of chivalric renewal, Henry VIII possessed a deep well of his father's paranoia, combined with a colossal ego and a capacity for brutal, unpredictable cruelty. In this new, more volatile and personal court, the power of the Privy Chamber and its chief officer, the Groom of the Stool, did not diminish, it exploded. Henry VIII, unlike his father, did not want to rule from a counting house. He wanted to delegate the tedious work of administration while he enjoyed the glories of kingship. This created a fierce competition for his attention and favor. Power at the court of Henry VIII was a direct reflection of a personal relationship with the king, and no one had a more personal relationship with him than his Groom of the Stool. The men who held the post under Henry VIII were his boon companions, his minions, the members of his inner circle who shared his private pleasures. The first and most prominent was Sir William Compton. A childhood friend of Henry's, Compton was almost the same age as the king and shared his passion for sports and women. He was appointed Groom of the Stool at the very beginning of the reign, and his career became the blueprint for the immense power the office could bestow. The intimacy of their relationship was legendary. Compton was not just an attendant, he was Henry's wingman, his fixer, and his confidant. He arranged the king's clandestine love affairs, most notably with Anne Stafford, a married noblewoman whose subsequent scandal rocked the court. He jousted alongside the king, managed his vast wardrobe, and oversaw his private entertainments. This personal favor translated into incredible political and financial power. Compton controlled the privy purse, which Henry used as a personal slush fund to reward his friends and pursue his projects. Compton's own financial records show him handling tens of thousands of pounds of the king's money. This control over royal patronage made him a vital power broker. Anyone who wanted a grant of land, a lucrative office, or a favourable hearing from the king knew that the surest route was through Sir William Compton. He amassed a personal fortune that was second only to the greatest dukes of the realm, acquiring over 80 manors and vast estates across England. He was a new man, par excellence, his spectacular rise a direct result of his personal access to the king, an access symbolised and cemented by his daily duties in the king's most private chambers. He was the ultimate insider, a man whose power was based not on noble birth or official title, but on the simple, invaluable fact that he was the king's friend. The terrifying precarity of this power was demonstrated by the fate of Compton's successor, Henry Norris. Norris, another of the king's close companions and a key figure in the Privy Chamber, rose to prominence during the king's great obsession, his desire to divorce Catherine of Aragon and marry the captivating Anne Boleyn. Norris was a staunch supporter of the Boleyn faction and a trusted intimate of both Henry and the new queen. For several years, he rode the crest of the wave, enjoying the king's favour and the immense influence that came with it. He was at the very centre of power during the most revolutionary years of Henry's reign. But in the Tudor court, proximity to power was also proximity to danger. When Henry's passion for Anne Boleyn turned to murderous rage in 1536, the king and his ruthless chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, needed a way to dispose of her legally. They concocted a series of treason charges, accusing the queen of adultery with 5 men, thereby making her guilty of treason against the king's person. The choice of the 5 men was a calculated act of political terror, designed to destroy the Queen's entire faction. And because of his well-known closeness to both the King and Queen, Henry Norris was a prime target. The very intimacy that had been the source of his power was now twisted into the proof of his treason. A casual conversation, a shared joke, an innocent moment of courtly familiarity with the Queen, all were reinterpreted as evidence of a torrid and treasonous affair. Norris was arrested, tried in a show trial where the verdict was a foregone conclusion, and executed on Tower Hill. His fall sent a chilling message throughout the court. No one was safe. The king's friendship was a fickle and deadly thing, and the man who shared the king's most intimate secrets one day could find his own head on the block the next. The final great groom of the stool of Henry's reign was Sir Anthony Denny, who attended the king in his last, terrifying years. Henry by this point was a grotesque caricature of his youthful self. Massively obese, unable to walk without assistance, his leg oozing from a painful, foul-smelling ulcer. He was a tyrant in constant pain, his temper explosive and his paranoia absolute. Denny's role was as much that of a male nurse as a courtier. He had to dress the king's ulcer, help move his immense bulk, and endure his terrifying rages. His position was one of immense physical and psychological endurance, but it was also a position of unparalleled political power. Denny was a committed Protestant reformer, and he used his access to the dying king to secure the future of the English Reformation. He, along with Queen Catherine Parr and Archbishop Thomas Cranmer, formed the core of the reformist faction at court. In the king's final days, Denny controlled all access to the royal bedchamber. He kept his conservative rivals, like the Catholic Bishop Gardiner, away from the king. Most crucially, Denny was entrusted with the dry stamp, the metal stamp that replicated the king's signature and was used to authorize documents when Henry was too weak to sign them himself. It was Denny who, in the hours surrounding the king's death, applied this stamp to Henry's final will. This will established a regency council for the boy king, Edward VI, that was heavily dominated by the Protestant faction. This single act, performed by the Groom of the Stool, ensured that the English Reformation would not be reversed after Henry's death. It was the ultimate demonstration of the power of the office. The man whose job began with the king's bodily waste ended his career by dictating the spiritual and political future of the entire kingdom. The Tudor invention, born from a paranoid king's need for security, had evolved into the most potent and intimate office at the heart of the English state, a position of terrifying risk and almost unimaginable influence. To truly grasp the power and the strangeness of the Groom of the Stool, one must step out of the grand, public spaces of the Tudor court and enter a hidden world, a secret geography of power known as the Privy Chamber. This was more than just a suite of rooms. It was an institution, a political nerve center, and a social ecosystem all its own. It was the king's private domain, a fortress of intimacy built within the larger, more chaotic world of the royal palace. To be granted entry into this world was to be marked as one of the chosen few. To live and work within it was to inhabit the very heart of the kingdom's power. And the undisputed master of this secret world, the man who held its keys, guarded its doors, and orchestrated its daily life, was the Groom of the Stool. His authority was not derived from a formal constitutional role, but from his physical and administrative command over the space where the king was at his most authentic and his most vulnerable. The concept of the Privy Chamber was a Tudor innovation, a direct response by Henry VII to the treacherous, porous nature of the late medieval court. In the pre-Tudor era, the king's household, known as the Domus Regii Magnificentia, was a vast, sprawling, and surprisingly public institution. The king lived his life largely on display, surrounded by the great magnates of the realm who saw it as their right to attend him. The main hall of the palace was the center of court life, where the king would dine in public and conduct much of his business. His bedchamber, while private, was still staffed by a wide array of servants and was accessible to high-ranking nobles. This openness had proven to be a fatal weakness. It allowed for the formation of factions, for plots to be hatched in the corridors of power, and, as the Wars of the Roses had shown, it left the king's own person dangerously exposed. Henry VII, with his characteristic paranoia and obsession with control, changed all of this. He implemented a radical reorganization of the royal household, cleaving it in two. The public-facing part of the court remained, now known as the household below stairs, under the traditional authority of the Lord Steward. This was the world of the Great Hall, the kitchens, the stables, the vast logistical operation required to feed and house the hundreds of people who made up the court. But Henry created a new, separate and far more exclusive institution, the household above stairs, or the Privy Chamber, under the direct personal control of the king himself. This was to be the king's private apartment, a secure zone shielded from the prying eyes and unwelcome influence of the wider court. The Privy Chamber was a suite of interconnected rooms, a physical manifestation of a series of concentric rings of access leading to the king. The journey into this inner sanctum was a carefully filtered one. One would first enter the guard chamber, staffed by the yeomen of the guard, the king's new personally loyal bodyguard. Past the guards, one might be admitted to the presence chamber, the formal reception room where the king, seated on his throne under a canopy of state, would receive ambassadors and conduct public business. This was the limit of access for most courtiers. To go further was to enter the world of true influence. Beyond the presence chamber lay the door to the Privy Chamber itself. This door was a powerful symbol, a frontier between the public king and the private man. It was guarded at all times, and entry was a privilege granted only by the king's express permission. Crossing that threshold meant leaving the world of formal ceremony and entering a world of intimate, personal politics. The Privy Chamber typically consisted of a series of rooms, a main receiving room, a withdrawing chamber, a study or library, the Privy Library, and at its very heart, the royal bedchamber. Adjacent to the bedchamber, or sometimes within it, was the innermost sanctum, the small room or closet containing the close stool, the operational headquarters of the Groom of the Stool. The staff of this private world were a new breed of courtier. They were not the great hereditary officers of state, but the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, a hand-picked team of usually between 12 and 20 men who served the king directly. These were the king's personal companions, men chosen for their loyalty, their discretion, and their ability to amuse and serve the monarch. They were his jousting partners, his hunting companions, his partners at the card table, and his drinking buddies. They were drawn mostly from the gentry and lesser nobility, men whose careers were entirely dependent on the king's personal whim. They were, in essence, the king's trusted entourage, his inner circle. And at the very top of this elite pyramid, the first among equals, was the Groom of the Stool. While the gentlemen of the Privy Chamber served in rotation, the Groom's position was a permanent, full-time responsibility. He was the chief administrator of this entire private world. His duties were extensive and gave him control over every aspect of the king's private life. First and foremost, he was the chief bodyguard and security officer of the king's person within his own rooms. He was responsible for locking the doors at night and holding the keys. He organized the watch of the yeomen outside the chamber. He monitored every servant who entered, from the laundress who brought the king's clean linen to the page who brought his food. The threat of poison was a constant and very real fear in the 16th century, and the Groom of the Stool was the final line of defense. He would often oversee the serving of the king's private meals, ensuring the elaborate rituals of tasting were observed to guard against a deliberate contamination. This role as the king's ultimate protector imbued him with an aura of immense responsibility and trust. Second, he was the king's personal body servant, the manager of the royal wardrobe and jewel house. He would help the king dress and undress each day, a ritual that was in itself a source of intimacy. He would be present for the quiet moments at the beginning and end of the day, when the king's guard was down. He had charge of the king's magnificent and fantastically expensive wardrobe, a dazzling collection of silks, velvets, and cloth of gold, trimmed with ermine and sable and studded with pearls and rubies. He also had custody of the king's personal jewels. This was not just a matter of looking after expensive things, it was a matter of managing symbols of power. The king's appearance was a vital part of his political persona, and the groom was the stage manager of this daily performance of majesty. Third, he was the king's private secretary and gatekeeper of information. The privy chamber was where the king read his most sensitive dispatches and wrote his private letters. The Groom of the Stool was always present and often directly involved. He would read to the king, take dictation, and affix the privy seal, or the king's personal signet, to documents. This meant he was privy to the most secret affairs of state, from delicate diplomatic negotiations to the king's orders for the arrest and execution of his enemies. He was the gatekeeper of access, both physical and informational. A courtier who wished to pass a private message to the king would give it to the groom. A minister who needed the king's signature on an urgent matter when the king was in his private apartments would have to go through the groom. This position as a communications hub made him an indispensable figure, a man who knew more about the day-to-day workings of the king's mind than anyone else. Fourth, and perhaps most significantly, he was the king's personal banker. He held the privy purse, the king's private cash fund. This was an enormous source of power. The national finances were managed by the exchequer, but the privy purse was the king's own money, to be spent as he pleased, with little to no oversight. Under a profligate king like Henry VIII, the sums of money that passed through the groom's hands were astronomical. He paid for the king's lavish gifts, his gambling losses. Henry was an enthusiastic and often unlucky gambler. His secret payments to spies and agents, and the wages of the privy chamber staff. This made the groom a vital figure in the web of courtly patronage. A poet seeking a royal pension, an artist seeking a commission, a courtier seeking a cash reward for service, all knew that the Groom of the Stool was the man who controlled the flow of the king's personal cash. This financial leverage could be used to build a vast network of clients and dependents, all of whom were indebted to the groom for his favor. The physical space of the privy chamber was therefore a reflection of its political function. It was a place of deep and deliberate contrasts. On the one hand, it was a space of incredible luxury and formal beauty. The rooms were hung with priceless tapestries from Flanders, depicting scenes from mythology or the Bible. The furniture was elaborately carved, the ceilings were gilded, and the air was scented with expensive perfumes burned in silver censers. It was a space designed to project an aura of serene and unassailable majesty. On the other hand, it was a space of intense, almost domestic intimacy. It was here that the king would play with his children, dote on his dogs, and relax with his closest friends. It was here that he would rage in frustration, weep in grief, and suffer the indignities of his aging and decaying body. And at the heart of this intimate space was the close stool. The very act of attending the king in this moment was the ultimate symbol of the groom's role. It was a moment of profound physical and psychological vulnerability for the monarch. In a culture deeply concerned with humours and bodily excretions as indicators of health, the groom of the stool became the king's primary medical observer. He was the first to know if the king was suffering from constipation or diarrhea, if there was blood in his stool, or if he was showing other signs of illness. He would be responsible for conveying this vital information to the royal physicians. He would show them the contents of the chamber pot, a physical specimen that the doctors would scrutinize with the utmost seriousness, attempting to diagnose the state of the king's internal humors. The groom was therefore on the front line of monitoring the king's health, a matter of supreme national importance. This medical function further enhanced his power. In an age of sudden and deadly illnesses, the king's health was a constant source of anxiety. The groom's reports could influence not only the king's medical treatment, but also the political calculations of the entire court. If the groom let it be known that the king was suffering from a bout of digestive trouble, factions might pause their maneuvering, waiting to see if the illness would pass. If he reported the king was in robust health, it might embolden certain ministers to push forward with their policies. The state of the king's bowels was, in a very real sense, a state secret, and the groom of the stool was its sole proprietor. The physical layout of the privy chamber, therefore, was a map of power. The further one penetrated into its depths, the closer one came to the king's person, and the greater one's influence became. The groom of the stool, by virtue of his duties, had a pass to every single one of these spaces at any time of day or night. He was the only person, other than the queen and perhaps the royal physicians, who was permitted to enter the king's bedchamber unbidden. This unfettered access, this constant presence in the unguarded moments of the king's life, was the true source of his power. He was not a great minister who derived his authority from a formal office of state. He was a courtier whose power was purely personal, a reflection of the king's trust and affection. The privy chamber was his kingdom, and within its walls, he was second only to the monarch himself. The man who began his day by preparing the king's toilet ended it as one of the most powerful political operators in the land, his position a testament to the strange and intimate logic of the Tudor court, where the path to power lay not through the council chamber, but through the king's private closet. The title, Groom of the Stool, is so viscerally specific, so focused on a single, humble, and to our minds repulsive function that it actively misleads. It creates an image of a man whose entire existence was dedicated to the maintenance of the royal toilet. While this duty was indeed the foundation of his office and the primary symbol of his unique intimacy with the king, to imagine that this was the sum total of his responsibilities is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of the role. The attendance at the close stool was merely the key that unlocked the door. Once inside the king's private world, the groom's duties expanded exponentially, transforming him from a mere body servant into a figure of immense and multifaceted authority. He was the king's personal secretary, his confidential advisor, his private banker, his chief of staff, and in many ways, his most trusted friend and companion. The wipe was just the beginning. The power that followed was almost limitless. Let us first examine the role of the groom as the king's personal secretary and gatekeeper of information. In the Tudor and early Stuart periods, the machinery of government was not yet the impersonal bureaucracy it would later become. It was deeply and inextricably linked to the king's physical person. While the great councils of state, like the Privy Council, handled the formal business of governance, the king remained the ultimate executive. His personal approval, his signature, his will was required for all major decisions, and much of this personal political work took place not in the noisy public council chamber, but in the quiet seclusion of the Privy Chamber. It was here that the king would review the most sensitive state papers, read secret intelligence reports from his spies abroad, and formulate his personal responses to diplomatic overtures. The Groom of the Stool was not just present for these moments, he was an active participant. Many Tudor monarchs, including the formidable Henry VIII, preferred to have their correspondence read aloud to them. The Groom of the Stool, a man chosen for his education and discretion, was often the one tasked with this duty. Imagine the scene. The king, relaxing in his private withdrawing chamber, listens as his most trusted attendant reads a secret dispatch from the English ambassador in Paris, detailing the shifting factions at the French court. The groom, by virtue of being the reader, becomes the first filter of that information. His tone of voice, his emphasis on a particular phrase, the subtle way he might summarize a passage, all could subtly influence the king's perception of the news. He was not a passive reader, he was an active interpreter, shaping the flow of information at its very source. Furthermore, the groom would often take dictation from the king, writing down the monarch's private letters and instructions. This meant he was privy to the king's immediate, unvarnished thoughts and strategies before they were polished into formal state documents. He knew precisely what the king thought of the Holy Roman Emperor, what private instructions he was sending to his Lord Deputy in Ireland, or what threats he was levelling against a recalcitrant nobleman. This secret knowledge was an invaluable political asset. While the Lord Chancellor might only know the final, formal policy, the Groom of the Stool knew the emotional and intellectual journey the king had taken to arrive at it. He knew the king's doubts, his rages, his private motivations. This gave him an almost unparalleled ability to predict the king's future actions, a skill that made him an essential source of informal intelligence for every other ambitious figure at court. This role as scribe and reader naturally evolved into that of an advisor. In the quiet of the Privy Chamber, away from the posturing and flattery of the formal council, the king would often think aloud, using his groom as a sounding board. "What think you of this, Norris?" Henry VIII might ask, after having a particularly frustrating letter from the Pope read to him. The groom was in a unique position to offer a candid opinion. He was not a great minister whose advice was a matter of formal record. He could speak freely as a trusted friend, offering a perspective unburdened by the weight of official responsibility. He could offer praise for a minister the king favoured, or subtly cast doubt on the competence of one he disliked. He could gently guide the king towards a particular course of action, not through formal debate, but through a series of quiet conversations and well-placed observations. The groom's advice was powerful because it was personal, delivered in a context of intimacy and trust that no other minister could replicate. This advisory role was buttressed by the groom's absolute control over who was granted a private audience with the king. While formal audiences took place in the presence chamber, a quick private word with the king in his privy chamber was often far more effective. The Groom of the Stool was the gatekeeper to these vital, informal encounters. A minister seeking to press an urgent point, a courtier with a personal plea, or a petitioner seeking a grant of land, all knew that gaining the groom's goodwill was the essential first step. The groom could grant access, or he could deny it, claiming the king was tired, unwell, or simply not to be disturbed. He could orchestrate accidental meetings in the privy gallery, allowing a favoured courtier a seemingly chance encounter with the monarch. By controlling the king's daily schedule and the flow of people around him, the groom could actively shape the king's social and political environment, promoting his friends and allies while isolating his rivals. Beyond the world of information and advice, the Groom of the Stool wielded the very tangible power of the purse. His control of the king's privy purse made him a central figure in the financial life of the court. The privy purse was, in essence, the king's personal bank account, funded by revenues from specific crown lands and other sources, and it was a fund of enormous importance. The formal state treasury, the exchequer, was a slow-moving, bureaucratic institution responsible for the grand finances of the realm, paying for armies, navies, and the salaries of state officials. The privy purse, by contrast, was a flexible and secret source of cash, dispensed at the king's immediate discretion. The Groom of the Stool administered this fund. He kept the accounts, held the cash in locked coffers within the privy chamber, and made payments on the king's verbal command. The range of these payments was vast. He paid for the king's new clothes, his jewels, and the furnishings for his private apartments. He paid the wages of the other gentlemen of the privy chamber, the musicians, the artists, and the other personal attendants who made up the king's private world. This made him the paymaster for an entire section of the royal household, a position that naturally commanded loyalty and deference. More significantly, the privy purse was the source of the king's personal largesse. It was from this fund that the king would pay his gambling debts, give lavish tips to visiting performers, or bestow gifts upon his favoured courtiers and mistresses. When Henry VIII wanted to send a secret gift of cash to a foreign diplomat or a spy, it was the Groom of the Stool who would discreetly arrange the payment. This made the Groom the paymaster of the king's secret political life. His account books, had they been made public, would have revealed a secret history of the reign, a map of the king's private passions and political machinations. This financial power also meant that the Groom was deeply involved in the king's personal hobbies and projects. When Henry VIII, a passionate and knowledgeable musician, wanted to purchase a new set of lutes or commission a new composition from a court musician, it was the Groom who handled the transaction. When Henry, an avid sportsman, wanted to lay a wager on a game of tennis or a cockfight, it was the Groom who held the stakes and paid out the winnings, or, more often, covered the king's losses. When Henry became obsessed with architecture and began a series of magnificent building projects like the construction of Nonsuch Palace, his grooms were often deeply involved in managing the finances for the more personal aspects of the design and furnishings. They were, in essence, the project managers of the king's private life. Perhaps the most surprising extension of the groom's duties was his role as a de facto curator and librarian. The king's most valuable personal possessions, his private collection of books, his scientific instruments like astrolabes and clocks, his maps, and his art collection, were often kept within the privy chamber for security. The Groom of the Stool, as the chief officer of this space, naturally took on the responsibility for managing and caring for these collections. He would organize the king's library, commission new book bindings, and acquire new volumes on the king's behalf. Men like Sir Anthony Denny were noted scholars and patrons of learning in their own right, and they shared the king's intellectual interests. They were not just servants, but intellectual companions, men who could discuss the latest work of theology or humanist philosophy with the king. This multifaceted role, secretary, advisor, banker, chief of staff, and companion, meant that the man holding the post had to be exceptionally talented. He needed to be physically robust to keep up with the demands of personal service. He needed to be educated, literate, and numerate to handle the secretarial and financial duties. He needed to be socially adept and politically astute to navigate the treacherous currents of the court. And above all, he needed to possess an almost superhuman level of discretion and an unshakable loyalty to the king. The king confided in him, in every sense of the word. He confided his bodily waste, his secret thoughts, his private funds, and the management of his daily life. The physical intimacy of the role was the key that held all these other functions together. The daily ritual of attending the king on the close stool was a constant, tangible reinforcement of the groom's unique status. It was a ritual that no other great minister, no matter how powerful, could participate in. The Lord Chancellor might kneel before the king in the council chamber, but the Groom of the Stool stood beside him in his most private closet. This proximity bred a level of familiarity that was unique. The groom learned to read the king's moods, not just from his words, but from his sighs, his grimaces, his physical posture. He knew the king not as a remote and terrible sovereign, but as a man of flesh and blood, with all the accompanying frailties and needs. This profound, almost domestic knowledge gave the groom a different kind of power from that of a traditional minister. A minister's power was based on his office, his political faction, and his ability to deliver policy. The groom's power was based on his personal relationship with the monarch, It was a softer, more subtle, but often more resilient form of influence. Ministers could rise and fall with the shifting tides of policy, but the king would always need someone to attend him in the privy chamber. As long as the groom could retain the king's personal trust and affection, his position was secure. The role was therefore far more than a mere wipe. It was a complex, demanding, and incredibly powerful position that placed its holder at the very nexus of the king's personal and political lives. The man who began his duties with the king's body ended up with a profound influence over the body politic. To be the groom of the stool was to walk a tightrope suspended over a chasm of fire. This is no mere metaphor, it is the central, defining truth of the position. On one side of this precarious path lay rewards of an almost unimaginable scale, wealth that could rival the greatest ducal estates, political influence that could shape the course of the nation, and a social standing that elevated a man from the ranks of the mere gentry to a peer of the realm, a confidant of the monarch. On the other side lay a fall of catastrophic and absolute finality, swift, merciless disgrace, the immediate confiscation of every acre of land and every shilling of wealth, imprisonment in the cold, damp darkness of the Tower of London, and a final brutal and public encounter with the executioner's axe. The source of this extraordinary polarity, this incredible potential for both meteoric success and abyssal failure, was one and the same: intimacy. The very proximity to the king that was the wellspring of the groom's unique power also exposed him to a constant, grinding, and multifaceted level of danger that few other courtiers, even the most powerful ministers, ever had to face. He was the keeper of the king's secrets, the witness to his weaknesses, the manager of his moods, and a constant, unavoidable presence in the monarch's most volatile and unguarded moments. This dangerous intimacy, this life lived in the shadow of the throne, meant that his position, for all its glittering rewards, was perhaps the most perilous, most psychologically demanding, and most utterly terrifying job in the entire kingdom. The first and most immediate layer of this danger was the raw, physical, and emotional proximity to the king himself. We must divest ourselves of any notion of a modern, constitutionally constrained monarch. The Tudor king, and particularly Henry VIII, was an absolute sovereign in a way that is difficult for us to fully comprehend. He was the fount of all justice, the supreme head of the church, and the ultimate arbiter of life and death for every soul in his kingdom. His personal will was the law. And this immense, unchecked power was housed within the body of a man who was, especially in his later years, a creature of titanic and unpredictable passions. Henry was not just a king, he was a force of nature, and to be in his immediate orbit was to be in the path of a potential hurricane. His temper was legendary, a consuming rage that could be triggered by the slightest frustration or perceived slight. As he aged, this innate volatility was grotesquely magnified by the chronic, agonizing pain he endured. His famous jousting accident in 1536 had left him with a festering ulcer on his leg, a suppurating wound that refused to heal and tormented him for the rest of his life. It seeped foul-smelling pus, required daily painful dressings, and likely caused a form of chronic osteomyelitis. This constant grinding pain, combined with his massive weight gain which made him virtually immobile, transformed him into a tyrant ruled by his own physical misery. He would lash out, verbally and sometimes even physically, at those who were closest to him, the attendants of his privy chamber. While a great minister like Thomas Cromwell or Stephen Gardiner might face the king's formal displeasure in a council meeting, a structured and semi-public event, the groom of the stool had to endure these raw, unfiltered outbursts of fury in the suffocating, claustrophobic confines of the king's private apartments. He was the one present when the king awoke in pain, his leg throbbing. He was the one who had to assist the immense, irritable monarch with the difficult and undignified business of getting onto the close stool. He was the one who had to listen to the king's groans of pain, his curses against his physicians, his paranoid accusations against his courtiers. The groom had to become a master of emotional management, a psychologist of the highest order. He needed to know, with instinctual precision, when to offer a word of soothing sympathy, when to attempt a light-hearted distraction, when to engage in serious conversation, and when, most importantly, to simply stand silent, absorb the volcanic royal rage without flinching, and wait for the storm to pass. A single ill-judged word in these moments could be fatal. A suggestion that seemed impertinent, a look that was interpreted as pitying or insolent, a momentary lapse in attentiveness. Any of these could be seen as a crack in the perfect mirror of loyalty the groom was expected to present. Such a crack could shatter the entire bond of trust that was the foundation of his position, leading to immediate dismissal and disgrace. He had to be a perfect actor, his face a mask of serene competence and unwavering devotion, even when his royal master was roaring with pain and fury just inches away. This relentless psychological pressure, the need to be constantly vigilant and emotionally responsive to a dangerous and unpredictable man, was a form of danger all its own. This danger was, of course, magnified by the simple, inescapable fact of constant exposure. The courtier's life was a performance, and it was exhausting. Most other attendants and ministers, even those in the privy chamber, served in rotation. They had periods of duty and periods of leave, allowing them time to retreat from the intense gravitational pull of the monarch's personality, to rest, to politic, and to manage their own affairs. But the groom of the Stool's position was a permanent, all-consuming one. He was on call day and night. The king's needs did not adhere to a schedule. If the king was sleepless with pain at 3 in the morning and wished to talk or play a game of cards, it was the groom who was summoned. If the king had a sudden bout of indigestion after a heavy supper, it was the groom who had to attend him. This relentless proximity carried a significant risk. The risk that familiarity would erode the vital mystique of monarchy and breed, if not contempt, then a fatal carelessness. The king was acutely aware that he was surrounded by men who wanted something from him. He was a master at detecting flattery and insincerity. He therefore demanded a relationship with his groom that was both intimate and yet perfectly respectful of the immense gulf that separated them. The groom had to be a friend, but he could never forget he was a subject. He had to be a companion, but he could never be an equal. He had to walk a line of impossible fineness, and a single misstep, a moment of over-familiarity or a presumption of privilege, could be interpreted by the paranoid king as a sign that the groom was beginning to abuse his position. In a court where every relationship was a transaction, the groom's genuine affection for the king, if he had it, had to be constantly tempered by the cold, hard reality of his subordinate and perilous position. The second great sphere of danger emanated not from the king himself, but from the court that swirled around him. The groom of the Stool, by virtue of his unparalleled access and profound influence, was automatically the object of intense and universal envy. Every other ambitious person at court, from the most powerful duke of the ancient nobility to the most grasping new man on the make, viewed the groom as a primary rival for the king's attention, affection, and patronage. The court of Henry VIII was a political ecosystem as vicious and predatory as any jungle. It was a zero-sum game, where one person's rise inevitably meant another's decline. In this environment, the groom of the Stool was the man who stood closest to the sun, and everyone else was jostling in the shadows, looking for a way to pull him down and take his place. This political warfare was fought not with swords, but with whispers. The primary weapon was intrigue. The groom's rivals would work ceaselessly to undermine him, to poison the king's mind against him. They would spread malicious rumors, often through indirect channels, hoping they would reach the king's ear. They might question the groom's financial honesty, suggesting that he was skimming from the privy purse. They might impugn his loyalty, hinting that he was secretly in league with a rival faction or a foreign power. They might criticize his competence, reporting exaggerated stories of minor mistakes he had made in his duties. The groom had to be constantly vigilant, aware that his reputation was under perpetual assault. He had to cultivate his own network of spies and allies simply to stay informed of the plots being hatched against him. His role as the gatekeeper to the king made him particularly vulnerable to creating enemies. For every courtier he delighted by granting a coveted private audience with the monarch, there were dozens more whom he had to refuse. The king's time and energy were finite, and the groom's primary duty was to protect him from the endless tide of supplicants. Each refusal, no matter how politely phrased, created a pocket of resentment. A powerful nobleman like the Duke of Norfolk, accustomed to deference, would not take kindly to being told by a mere gentleman like the Groom of the Stool that the king was indisposed. He would not blame the king. He would blame the servant who stood in his way, seeing him as an arrogant upstart who was exceeding his authority. Over the course of a career, a successful groom would inevitably accumulate a long and dangerous list of such slighted magnates, all of whom would be secretly praying for his downfall and ready to contribute to it should the opportunity arise. He had to navigate this minefield of bruised egos and thwarted ambitions with the dexterity of a master diplomat, knowing that he was surrounded by enemies who smiled to his face while sharpening their knives behind his back. The most terrifying and instructive example of this political danger, a story that became a cautionary tale for all subsequent holders of the office, is the tragic and brutal fall of Henry Norris. Norris was the quintessential groom of the Stool, a man who had risen to the pinnacle of power through his close personal relationship with Henry VIII. He was a trusted friend, a companion in the hunt and at the card table, and a key figure in the king's private world during the most revolutionary period of his reign, the break with Rome and the rise of Anne Boleyn. Norris was a staunch member of the Boleyn faction, and when Anne became queen, his influence was at its absolute zenith. He was privy to the innermost secrets of the royal marriage, a witness to the passionate, stormy, and ultimately doomed relationship between Henry and Anne. This very intimacy, however, became the instrument of his annihilation. By 1536, Henry's infatuation with Anne had curdled into a cold and murderous hatred. His passion had shifted to the demure Jane Seymour, and he needed a way to get rid of Anne that was swift, legal, and final. A simple annulment would be complicated and might cast doubt on the legitimacy of their daughter, Princess Elizabeth. The king and his chief minister, the ruthlessly efficient Thomas Cromwell, settled on a more definitive solution. They would accuse the Queen of high treason in the form of adultery. To make such a shocking charge credible, they needed to name her supposed lovers. Cromwell, in a masterstroke of political terror, chose 5 men, a mix of court musicians and high-ranking gentlemen from the Privy Chamber. The goal was not just to destroy Anne, but to obliterate her entire faction, to remove all those who were most loyal to her from the heart of power. And who was more central to that world than Henry Norris, the Groom of the Stool? His daily, easy familiarity with the Queen, a familiarity born of his unique position within the Privy Chamber, was now reinterpreted through a lens of malicious suspicion. A shared glance, a light-hearted conversation, a moment of courtly flirtation, all were twisted into evidence of a clandestine and treasonous affair. The charge was, by all rational accounts, a grotesque fabrication. Norris's entire career was built on his personal loyalty to the king. It is almost inconceivable that he would risk everything, his life, his fortune, his family's future, for a secret affair with the notoriously sharp-tongued and demanding queen under the very nose of the pathologically jealous king. When arrested and interrogated in the Tower, Norris fiercely protested his innocence. It is said that the king, in a moment of doubt, offered Norris a pardon if he would only confess. Norris refused. He would not save his own life by validating a lie that would dishonor the queen. For this display of integrity, he was condemned. He was tried in a show trial, found guilty by a terrified jury, and on May 17, 1536, he was led out onto Tower Hill. Along with the other accused men, he was publicly beheaded. His execution was a brutal, stark warning to every single person at court. It demonstrated with chilling clarity that no amount of faithful service, no degree of personal friendship with the king could protect a man when the great wheels of state policy began to turn. The king's most intimate servant was, in the end, just as disposable as any other. The fall of Henry Norris illustrated the supreme danger of the groom's position. His power was entirely derivative, a reflection of the king's favor. When that favor was withdrawn, for whatever reason, he had no institutional or independent power base to fall back on. He was utterly exposed, a man whose life was built on the whim of a tyrant. A third, and often underestimated danger, was the constant, grinding risk of physical contagion. The groom of the stool was the king's primary caregiver, working in the closest possible proximity to the royal body. In an age with no understanding of germ theory, where medical knowledge was a blend of classical humoral theory and folk superstition, and where epidemic diseases could scythe through the population with terrifying speed, this was an exceptionally perilous place to be. When the king was ill, the groom was on the front line. He would be the one to hold the basin when the king vomited, the one to help change his sweat-soaked bed linens, the one to sit with him through the long nights of fever. He was directly and repeatedly exposed to whatever pathogens had afflicted the monarch. The sweating sickness, or pseudo-anglicus, was a particularly terrifying threat during the Tudor period. It was a mysterious and virulent disease, characterized by the sudden onset of fever, headaches, profuse sweating, and respiratory distress. It was terrifyingly swift. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. The disease swept through England in a series of devastating epidemics, and it had a particular predilection for the crowded, unsanitary conditions of the royal court. When an outbreak occurred, the typical response of those who could afford it was to flee to the countryside, to isolate themselves from the contagion. The court would often disperse in a panic, but the groom of the stool, along with the royal physicians, had no choice but to remain at his post, a stationary target for the disease. He had to breathe the same air as the sick king, touch his body, and handle his soiled linens, all while knowing that he could be the next to fall victim. Sir William Compton, Henry VIII's first and much-loved groom, died of the sweating sickness during the outbreak of 1528. His death was a stark reminder that the job carried a very real risk of mortality, a danger that was entirely separate from the political machinations of the court. The role demanded not just political cunning, but a high degree of physical courage and a stoic acceptance of personal risk. Finally, there was the unique and insidious danger that came from being the keeper of the king's deepest secrets. The groom was a living repository of forbidden knowledge. He was the witness to the king's sins, his moral compromises, his moments of doubt, his private humiliations, and his acts of personal cruelty. He knew the true, often petty and vindictive reasons behind the fall of great ministers. He knew the sordid details of the king's extramarital affairs and the identities of his mistresses. He was aware of the king's secret anxieties, his vanities, his fears of aging and death. This encyclopedic knowledge of the king's psyche was a heavy and deeply dangerous burden to carry. While it was the source of his informal power and influence, it also made him a man who knew too much. A king, especially a tyrant like Henry VIII, could not afford to have such a man become his enemy. The potential for blackmail, or even just a damaging leak of information, was too great. The relationship between the king and his groom had to be one of absolute, unbreakable trust, a bond more akin to that between a confessor and a penitent than an employer and an employee. The groom had to be a living vault, prepared to carry the secrets of the kingdom to his grave. Any hint that he was using his secret knowledge for his own advancement, or that he was gossiping about the king's private life, would be seen as the ultimate betrayal. The fate of Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of Henry VIII's privy chamber, serves as a chilling illustration of the king's reaction to this kind of intimate betrayal. While not the groom himself, Culpeper was a close intimate of the aging king, a young, handsome courtier who enjoyed the king's favor and the privileged access that came with it. Recklessly and foolishly, he used this privileged position to conduct a secret affair with the king's fifth wife, the teenage queen, Catherine Howard. When the affair was inevitably discovered, the king's rage was not just that of a cuckolded husband. It was the fury of a sovereign whose most sacred private space had been violated, whose trust had been monstrously betrayed by a man he had favored. The betrayal was so personal, so profound, that the punishment had to be exemplary. Culpeper was charged with high treason, and his initial sentence was to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most gruesome and dishonorable death imaginable, a punishment designed to communicate the full horror of his crime. Only as a final, small mercy did the king commute the sentence to a simple beheading. The lesson was crystal clear. Intimacy was a privilege, not a right, and its violation would be met with a special kind of royal ferocity. The life of the Groom of the Stool was thus a constant, high-wire act, a performance that had to be sustained without error for years on end. He had to be a perfect courtier, navigating the treacherous currents of envy and ambition. He had to be a perfect servant, his loyalty and discretion beyond question. He had to be a perfect friend, offering companionship and honest counsel while never once forgetting the terrifying, unbridgeable gulf that separated him from his royal master. He lived his life in the full, unforgiving glare of the king's favor, a position that brought him immense warmth, power, and light, but also carried with it the constant, terrifying risk of being incinerated in a sudden flash of royal displeasure. The path to power and wealth was through the king's most private chambers, but that path was lined with the ghosts of those who had stumbled, a gallery of fallen favorites who served as a constant, silent reminder that the king's most intimate servant was also, in the final analysis, his most profoundly expendable one. For the men who successfully navigated the treacherous currents of the Tudor court and managed to retain the king's favor, the rewards for their service as Groom of the Stool were almost beyond measure. The position, for all its dangers and its seemingly humble origins, was a veritable launchpad to spectacular wealth, immense social prestige, and a level of political influence that could shape the destiny of the nation. The king's gratitude was not expressed in mere words or modest pensions. It was a torrent of tangible, life-altering patronage that could transform a man of the minor gentry into one of the richest and most powerful figures in the kingdom. The rewards came in many forms: land, offices, titles, and invaluable political capital, and they served a dual purpose. They were a personal reward for loyal and intimate service, but they were also a public declaration of the king's favor, a signal to the rest of the court that the Groom of the Stool was a man to be respected, feared, and obeyed as a direct extension of the royal will. The most fundamental and enduring form of wealth in the 16th century was land. Land was the basis of social status, political power, and economic security. To be a great man was to be a great landowner, and the king, as the ultimate proprietor of all land in the realm, was the source of all real estate advancement. The Grooms of the Stool were showered with land grants on a truly colossal scale. These grants came from the vast portfolio of the Crown lands, which included royal manors, forests, and properties that had reverted to the Crown through forfeiture or lack of an heir. A loyal groom could expect to receive a steady stream of grants throughout his career, beginning with a modest manor and culminating in a vast network of estates spread across multiple counties. The career of Sir William Compton, Henry VIII's first groom, is a staggering example of this process. Starting as a mere country gentleman with a respectable but unremarkable inheritance, Compton died in 1528 as one of the wealthiest men in England, a landed magnate whose holdings could rival those of ancient ducal families. His accounts show a relentless accumulation of property. He was granted the stewardship and castles of Kenilworth, Warwick, and Fulbrook. He was given manors in more than a dozen counties, from Buckinghamshire to Gloucestershire. This was not just a reward, it was a strategic placement of a loyal agent. By making his groom a major landowner in a particular region, the king was inserting a man of unquestionable loyalty into the local power structure, a man who could serve as a check on the influence of the traditional and potentially less reliable regional nobility. This process of enrichment reached a fever pitch during the 1530s with one of the most revolutionary events in English history: the dissolution of the monasteries. Between 1536 and 1540, the government of Henry VIII, having broken with the Church of Rome, systematically dissolved hundreds of monasteries, priories, and convents across the country. This resulted in the largest single transfer of land since the Norman conquest. A vast ocean of property, monastic buildings, rich agricultural lands, forests and fisheries was seized by the crown. The king now had an unprecedented amount of land at his disposal to reward his loyal servants. The gentlemen of the privy chamber and the groom of the stool, above all, were among the primary beneficiaries of this massive windfall. They were in the perfect position to petition the king for the most desirable monastic properties. Sir Anthony Denny, Henry's last groom, was a master at acquiring these lands. A man with strong Protestant sympathies, he likely felt no religious scruples about profiting from the destruction of the old church. He acquired the rich lands of the Abbey of St Albans, one of the oldest and wealthiest Benedictine houses in England. He was granted the lands of Waltham Abbey. His property portfolio, already substantial, swelled to enormous proportions, cementing his status as a great regional power in Hertfordshire and Essex. This accumulation of monastic land by the men closest to the king had a profound political effect. It created a new class of powerful landowners whose wealth and status were directly and irrevocably tied to the royal supremacy and the break with Rome. They now had a massive vested interest in preventing any future return to the Catholic faith, as this would inevitably call their land titles into question. The king, by enriching his most intimate servants, was also binding them to his religious revolution with chains of gold and property deeds. Beyond direct grants of land, the second great avenue to wealth was the acquisition of offices. The Tudor state was a vast web of appointed positions, many of which carried with them significant salaries, fees, and opportunities for patronage. The groom of the stool, as the king's favourite, was in a prime position to collect these offices like a child collecting seashells. The number of official titles held by a man like William Compton or Anthony Denny is bewildering. A groom would typically be appointed to a whole host of positions within the royal household and the wider kingdom. He might be made the constable of a royal castle, a position that came with a salary and control over a military garrison, the steward of a royal honour or duchy, giving him administrative and judicial authority over a large area, the keeper of a royal park or forest, granting him rights to timber and game, or the local sheriff of a county. Each of these offices was a source of income. It carried a direct salary, but more importantly, it came with a host of associated fees, perquisites, and opportunities for financial gain. The holder of an office could collect fees for affixing seals to documents, for holding court, or for granting licenses. Furthermore, many of these positions could be exercised by a deputy. A groom of the stool, who was required to be in constant attendance on the king, could not possibly fulfill the duties of being the sheriff of Kent and the constable of Dover Castle at the same time. So he would appoint a deputy, a local gentleman who would perform the actual work. In return for this appointment, the deputy would pay the groom a significant annual fee or give him a portion of the office's income. The groom could thus sit at court, collecting a passive income from a dozen different offices, his portfolio managed by a network of loyal deputies who were in turn dependent on his continued favour for their own positions. This created a vast pyramid of patronage, with the groom at its apex, his influence radiating out from the privy chamber into the shires and boroughs of the kingdom. This accumulation of wealth and offices naturally translated into immense social prestige. The groom of the stool, though often from a gentry background, lived and was treated like a great nobleman. He would maintain his own magnificent household, with dozens, if not hundreds, of his own servants and retainers, all wearing his personal livery. He would build grand country houses on his new estates, architectural marvels designed to showcase his wealth and status. These houses, like Compton Winyates, associated with Sir William Compton, were statements of power, filled with fine tapestries, silver plate, and luxurious furnishings, aping the royal court in miniature. This enhanced status was often formalized by the king through the granting of honors. Successful grooms of the stool were invariably knighted, becoming Sir Anthony or Sir Henry. They would be made members of the prestigious Order of the Garter, the highest order of chivalry in England, an honor reserved for the greatest magnates and foreign monarchs. On rare occasions, they might even be elevated to the peerage itself. John Dudley, who served as a gentleman of the Privy Chamber and was a close intimate of Henry VIII, though not Groom of the Stool, leveraged his position to become Viscount Lisle, then Earl of Warwick, and finally, during the reign of Edward VI, the all-powerful Duke of Northumberland. While the grooms themselves were not typically granted dukedoms, their children certainly were. The sons of the king's trusted servants were seen as excellent marriage prospects for the daughters of the established nobility. The groom could use his influence and wealth to arrange brilliant matches for his offspring, merging his new man family with the ancient bloodlines of the aristocracy. Within a generation, a family that had started as minor gentry could find itself at the very heart of the English nobility, its fortune founded on the intimate service performed in the king's private chambers. Perhaps the most valuable, though least tangible reward was the immense political capital that came with the position. The Groom of the Stool was at the epicenter of political life. He knew everything, and everyone knew that he knew everything. This gave him a unique authority. His words carried weight because everyone assumed they were a direct reflection of the king's own thoughts. When the groom spoke in a council meeting, his colleagues would listen with special attention, passing his words for clues to the monarch's secret intentions. This influence was often used to shape policy. Sir Anthony Denny, as we have seen, was a key player in the Reformation. He used his position to protect and promote Protestant clerics like Hugh Latimer and his own brother-in-law, the future Archbishop Matthew Parker. He used his influence over the dying king to ensure the establishment of a Protestant Regency Council for Edward VI. This was not the act of a mere servant, it was the act of a major political player, a man who used his intimate access to steer the course of the nation's religious and political history. His personal beliefs, amplified by his proximity to the king, became a powerful force in the grand narrative of the Tudor state. The groom could also act as a crucial, informal bridge between the king and his formal government. The king would often grow tired of his official ministers, finding them boring, sycophantic, or overbearing. He would retreat to the privy chamber, refusing to meet with them. In these situations, the Groom of the Stool became an essential intermediary. A minister like Thomas Cromwell might need to get an urgent paper signed or a quick decision from the king. He could not force his way into the king's presence, but he could go to the groom, explain the situation, and rely on his colleague in the privy chamber to approach the king at an opportune moment. The groom thus served as a vital lubricant in the often creaky machinery of personal monarchy, smoothing the relationship between the temperamental sovereign and his hard-pressed administrators. The rewards for this service were, therefore, a complex and interwoven tapestry of wealth, status, and power. The land grants provided the economic foundation. The accumulation of offices provided a steady stream of income and a vast network of patronage. The formal honors and brilliant marriages provided the social legitimacy, and the intimate knowledge and political capital provided the real, day-to-day influence. To be a successful Groom of the Stool was to win the ultimate lottery of courtly life. It was a role that demanded immense skill, psychological fortitude, and a healthy dose of luck. But for the handful of men who managed to play the game successfully, to retain the trust of their dangerous and demanding master until the very end, the prize was nothing less than a place among the masters of the kingdom. Their magnificent country houses, their extensive family trees, and their decisive impact on the course of English history are all silent testaments to the extraordinary power that could be wielded by the man whose career began, quite literally, with attending the king on his toilet. The golden age of the Groom of the Stool, that period of almost unimaginable personal power and influence wielded by men like William Compton and Anthony Denny, was intrinsically tied to the unique personality and political style of the Tudor monarchs, particularly Henry VIII. The role thrived in the hothouse atmosphere of his court, a world where personal intimacy with the sovereign was the ultimate currency. However, as the Tudor dynasty gave way to the Stuarts in 1603, the nature of the English court and the monarchy itself began to change. This transformation, driven by different royal personalities, shifting political philosophies, and the growing friction between the crown and parliament, led to a slow, gradual, but ultimately irreversible decline in the political significance of the Groom of the Stool. The office did not vanish overnight. It persisted for another century and a half, but it was slowly hollowed out, its raw political power draining away until it became largely a ceremonial honor, a prestigious but politically neutered echo of its former terrifying glory. The first signs of this transformation can be seen under the last Tudor monarch, Queen Elizabeth I. As a woman, Elizabeth could not, by the rigid gender conventions of the 16th century, have a groom of the stool. The idea of a man attending her in her most private moments was simply unthinkable. The intimate bodily service at the heart of the role was gender-specific. Instead, the functions of the office were split. The formal, administrative head of the Privy Chamber staff was a man, the Lord Chamberlain. But the intimate, personal care of the Queen's body and her private chambers fell to her senior female attendants, the ladies of the bedchamber, presided over by a chief gentlewoman. These women, like the famous Cat Ashley, who had been Elizabeth's governess, were her closest confidants and companions. They held immense personal influence, but it was of a different kind. It was less overtly political and more focused on the domestic and personal spheres. The direct, almost institutionalized link between attending the monarch's toilet and wielding vast political and financial power, which had been the hallmark of the male groom of the stool, was broken during her long reign. When James I, the first Stuart king, ascended the throne in 1603, the office of Groom of the Stool was revived. James, who had been King of Scotland for his entire life, was eager to adopt the grander, more structured model of the English court. He appointed a Groom of the Stool, and the position once again became one of immense favour and intimacy. However, the nature of that intimacy was different from what it had been under the Tudors. James I was a man who formed intense, all-consuming emotional attachments to a series of handsome young men, his favourites. His relationship with these men was the subject of widespread gossip and scandal, with many contemporaries and later historians concluding that they were homosexual in nature. Whether or not the relationships were physically consummated, they were certainly emotionally charged love affairs. The king's favourites, such as Robert Carr, Earl of Somerset, and later, the dazzlingly handsome George Villiers, who would be elevated to become the Duke of Buckingham, were showered with titles, wealth, and power on a scale that even Henry VIII's grooms would have envied. And the office of Groom of the Stool became inextricably linked with this system of favouritism. George Villiers, the greatest of all royal favourites, was appointed Groom of the Stool early in his meteoric rise. For James, the office was the ultimate expression of his affection and trust. It granted his beloved favourite the unparalleled access and daily intimacy that he craved. Buckingham's power did not stem from the office of Groom of the Stool, as it had for men like Compton. Rather, he, as the all-powerful favourite, naturally absorbed the office as one of his many titles, a symbol of the personal bond that was the true source of his authority. This created a subtle but important shift. The power of the groom was no longer seen as inherent to the office itself, but as a reflection of the king's passionate and often controversial personal affections. This made the position even more politically charged and resented by the wider court and political nation. The old Tudor grooms, while envied, were seen as loyal servants who had earned their position through long and discreet service. James's favourites were often seen as upstart pretty boys, catamites, who had bewitched the king and were corruptly monopolizing his patronage. The role became associated not just with power, but with a specific scandalous and deeply unpopular form of royal favoritism. This trend continued and was solidified under James's son, Charles I. Charles was a very different man from his father. He was reserved, dignified, and deeply committed to a high and rigid view of royal prerogative. He did not have the same need for emotional male favourites as his father, but he did maintain the structure of the bedchamber. The term privy chamber was gradually being replaced, and the office of Groom of the Stool as the pinnacle of courtly service. He appointed men of high aristocratic birth to the role, men who were his trusted political allies in his growing struggles against Parliament. The Groom of the Stool under Charles I was less a personal friend and more a senior member of the court party, a political grandee whose loyalty to the king's absolutist policies was unquestionable. The English Civil War, 1642 to 1651, and the execution of Charles I in 1649 represented a cataclysmic break in the history of the English monarchy and its court. For 11 years during the period of the Commonwealth and the Protectorate under Oliver Cromwell, England was a republic. The royal court, with all its elaborate rituals and offices, was abolished. The palaces were sold off or repurposed. The culture of personal monarchy, of which the Groom of the Stool was such a potent symbol, was utterly repudiated. The idea of a man gaining immense power simply by attending to the king's bodily needs seemed, to the sober, puritanical minds of the new regime, a perfect example of the decadence and corruption of the old order. When the monarchy was restored in 1660 with the return of Charles II, the son of the executed king, the court was re-established, and the office of Groom of the Stool was brought back with it. Charles II's court was a notoriously pleasure-loving and dissolute place, a reaction against the grim austerity of the Cromwellian years. It was a world of mistresses, playwrights, and libertine courtiers. The king appointed his closest friends and political allies to the key positions in his bedchamber. Men like Sir John Granville, later Earl of Bath, who had been instrumental in orchestrating the Restoration, were rewarded with the post of Groom of the Stool. The position was still the most senior office in the bedchamber, carrying a high salary and immense prestige. The groom was still a figure of considerable influence, a man who had the king's ear and could act as a conduit for patronage. However, the political landscape of England had fundamentally changed. The king was no longer the all-powerful, semi-divine figure that Henry VIII had been. Parliament, having won the Civil War, had established itself as a permanent and powerful force in the government of the nation. The king could no longer rule by personal will alone. He had to manage Parliament, to negotiate for funds, and to work through his official ministers who could command a majority in the House of Commons. Political power was slowly but surely migrating away from the king's private chambers and into the more public arenas of the council chamber, the cabinet, and the Houses of Parliament. This meant that while the Groom of the Stool remained a position of great courtly prestige, its direct political influence began to wane. A great minister like the Earl of Clarendon or the Earl of Danby derived his power from his ability to manage Parliament and control the state's finances, not from his personal intimacy with the king. While the groom's friendship with the king was still a valuable asset, it was no longer the ultimate key to political power. The king might still complain about his ministers to his groom in private, but he could not simply dismiss them on a whim if they commanded a majority in Parliament. The informal, personal power of the Privy Chamber was being superseded by the more formal, institutional power of parliamentary government. The role also began to shed its more visceral, hands-on duties. While the title remained, the actual task of cleaning the close stool was increasingly delegated to lower-ranking pages and servants. The groom would still attend the king, holding the towel and the basin of water, but the dirtiest part of the job was passed down the line. The role was becoming more supervisory, more ceremonial. It was still about proximity and access, but the stark, physical reality that had defined the role under the Tudors was being sanitized and abstracted. This trend continued under the later Stuart and Hanoverian monarchs. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which deposed the Catholic James II and brought William and Mary to the throne, dealt another major blow to the old model of personal monarchy. The Bill of Rights of 1689 firmly established the supremacy of Parliament, and the system of constitutional monarchy, in which the monarch reigns but does not rule, began to take shape. Power was now unambiguously located in the hands of ministers who could command a majority in the House of Commons. The office of Groom of the Stool survived this transition, but it was now almost entirely an honorific position. It was awarded to great noblemen, powerful dukes and earls, as a mark of supreme royal favour and a reward for political loyalty to the government of the day. The Groom of the Stool in the 18th century was typically a senior member of the ruling Whig or Tory party, a great aristocrat who would attend the king on formal occasions. He was the first lord of the bedchamber, the most senior courtier in the royal household, a position that came with a handsome salary and immense social cachet, but he was not the king's primary political advisor or his personal banker. That role was now filled by the Prime Minister. The informal power of the back rooms had been almost entirely replaced by the formal power of the front bench. The very title, Groom of the Stool, began to seem archaic and embarrassing to the more refined sensibilities of the Georgian era. It was gradually and informally replaced by the more dignified-sounding Groom of the Stole. The stole was said to refer to a long robe or scarf worn by the monarch on ceremonial occasions, and the groom's duty was redefined as being the one who placed this garment on the king. This was almost certainly a later invention, a polite fiction designed to obscure the role's earthy and explicit origins. It was a piece of etymological deodorizing, a way of preserving a historic and prestigious title while erasing its connection to the monarch's bodily functions. The office continued in this ceremonial form throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries. The appointments were purely political. When a new government came to power, the old Groom of the Stool would resign along with the outgoing ministers, and the new prime minister would appoint one of his own senior aristocratic supporters to the post. It was a valuable piece of political patronage, a sinecure to reward a loyal duke. The final transformation, the official end of this long and strange story, came during the reign of Queen Victoria. Just as with Elizabeth I, the gender of the monarch made the title problematic. The role was officially altered during the reign of her predecessor, William IV, and then formally abolished upon Victoria's accession in 1837. The duties of the First Lord of the Bedchamber were subsumed into a new office, the Mistress of the Robes, the senior lady of the Queen's household. The male equivalent for a king was now the Master of the Horse, another great ceremonial officer. The title of Groom of the Stool, which had survived for nearly 4 centuries, was finally consigned to the history books. Its disappearance marked the end of an era. The role could only exist in a world where the king's physical body was seen as the literal embodiment of the state. It thrived on a system of personal monarchy, where access to the sovereign's person was the ultimate source of power. As the monarchy became more institutional, more constitutional, and more private, the logic that had underpinned the groom's power simply evaporated. The king's body became his own private affair, no longer a site of public ritual and political contestation. The invention of the flush toilet and modern plumbing also played a part, rendering the entire apparatus of the close stool and its attendant obsolete. The transformation was complete. A role that had begun as a position of terrifying intimacy and immense political power. A role that had made men rich and powerful beyond their wildest dreams, had slowly, over the course of centuries, faded into a mere ceremonial title before vanishing altogether, a strange and potent relic of a world where the path to power was paved with a proximity to the monarch that was as absolute as it was, to our minds, profoundly and unforgettably weird. To look back upon the long, strange, and often unsettling history of the Groom of the Stool is to do far more than simply uncover a curious, long-forgotten anecdote from the dusty annals of the English court. It is to hold a strange, ornate, and deeply distorting mirror up to the very nature of power, the intricate theatre of monarchy, and the profound, almost mystical connection that once existed between the physical body of a single individual and the conceptual body of an entire nation. The existence of this office, its astonishing rise to a pinnacle of influence, and its slow, inevitable decline into ceremonial obsolescence, tells us a story that is fundamental to the very DNA of the modern Western world. It is a story about the evolution of the state from a personal fiefdom to an abstract bureaucracy, the changing perception of the human body from a public symbol to a private vessel, and the deep, enduring, and often dangerous fusion of the personal and the political. The Groom of the Stool is not just a historical curiosity to be snickered at. He is a key, a Rosetta Stone, to deciphering the logic of a lost world. A world that understood the term body politic in a manner so literal, so visceral, and so breathtakingly intimate that it almost defies our modern comprehension. The central foundational lesson that the story of the Groom of the Stool hammers home with unrelenting force is the absolute, unassailable supremacy of proximity in a system of personal monarchy. In a world before written constitutions, before the sovereignty of independent parliaments, before the very idea of a state as an abstract entity that could exist separately from its ruler, all power, all authority, all law, and all legitimacy flowed directly and indivisibly from a single, living source, the king's physical person. The king did not merely run the state, he was the state. His will was the law. His favor was the sole source of all social, political, and financial advancement. His displeasure was the chilling herald of absolute ruin. In such a system, political power was not a matter of winning a democratic election, mastering a complex policy brief, or demonstrating administrative competence. It was, first and foremost, a matter of winning the king's personal, private, and often fickle trust and affection. The entire political world was a frantic, desperate, and ceaseless game of access, and the Groom of the Stool, by the very definition of his bizarre office, was its undisputed, enthroned, and often terrified grandmaster. To understand how this could be so, one must grapple with the central theological and political doctrine of the age, the concept of the king's two bodies, a theory most famously articulated for modern historians by Ernst Kantorowicz. This doctrine held that the monarch possessed two distinct but inseparable bodies. The first was his body natural, corpus naturale, the physical, mortal flesh that he shared with all other human beings. This was the body that was born, that aged, that felt pleasure and pain, that ate, slept, and defecated, and that would inevitably die and decay. But he also possessed a second, mystical body, his body politic, corpus politicum. This body was immortal, infallible, and indivisible. It was the divine vessel of sovereignty, the living embodiment of the realm itself. The body politic could never get sick, never be weak, and never die. When the king, the body natural, died, his body politic was instantly and seamlessly transferred to his successor, hence the famous proclamation, "The king is dead, long live the king." The Groom of the Stool existed at the very nexus of this paradox. He was the ultimate minister to the king's body natural. His duties were a litany of the mundane, the physical, the all-too-human. He was present for the king's most private and undignified moments, the moments when the monarch was least like a god and most like an ordinary mortal man. Yet because the two bodies were fused in the person of the king, this service to the profane body natural granted the groom a unique and unparalleled access to the sacred body politic. By attending to the king's physical waste, he gained influence over the king's political will. By dressing the king's mortal flesh, he helped to shape the policies of the immortal realm. This fusion of the sacred and the profane, the divine and the digestive, is the key to the groom's power. He operated in the liminal space between the man and the institution, and his influence derived from the fact that, in a personal monarchy, no such space truly existed. This role also tells us something profound about the nature of service and the concept of honor in the early modern world. Our modern sensibilities are conditioned to see a stark division between honorable and degrading labor. We value intellectual and professional work, and we tend to look down upon menial, physical tasks, particularly those involving the bodily waste of others. We would see the groom's duties as the absolute nadir of servitude, a job of unimaginable abjection. But this is to impose our own post-Enlightenment, meritocratic values on a society that operated according to a completely different logic. In the rigidly hierarchical, divinely ordained world of the 16th century, the honor of an action was determined not by the nature of the task, but by the status of the person for whom it was performed. To be a servant was not inherently degrading, it was the natural order of things. The crucial question was, whom did you serve? To clean the boots of a common merchant was the work of a lowly drudge. To be granted the high privilege of handing the king his boots was an honor that a nobleman would cherish. The logic extends perfectly to the close stool. To handle the waste of an ordinary person was unthinkable for a man of gentle birth. But to attend the king, God's chosen representative on earth, during this same act was to participate in a ritual of the highest intimacy and trust. The profound objection of the task was not just nullified, but inverted and transformed into a mark of supreme honor by the sheer, overwhelming majesty of the recipient. The Groom of the Stool did not see himself as a janitor. He saw himself as a privileged participant in the secret, inner life of a semi-divine being. His office was a public declaration to the entire world that he, above all other men, was the one whom the king trusted with his ultimate, inescapable vulnerability. This is the logic of a true courtly society, a solar system where all status, all honor, and all meaning are not intrinsic but are merely reflections of the light cast by the great sun of the monarch. Furthermore, the story of the Groom of the Stool is the story of a profound political and social revolution, the rise of the new man, and the consolidation of the centralized Tudor state. The feudal world of the late Middle Ages had been dominated by a powerful, hereditary, and often recalcitrant aristocracy. The great dukes and earls of the Wars of the Roses had based their power on their ancient bloodlines, their vast regional landholdings, and their ability to raise private armies. They often saw the king as little more than the first among equals, a man whose authority they would support only as long as it suited their own interests. The Tudor monarchs, beginning with the deeply suspicious Henry VII, dedicated themselves to breaking this independent aristocratic power. They needed to create a new class of powerful men who did not have a great, independent power base in the shires, but whose power, wealth, and status were derived solely from the king's personal favor. These new men would be utterly loyal because without the king, they were nothing. The Groom of the Stool was the archetypal Tudor new man. He was typically drawn not from the great ducal families, but from the ranks of the ambitious country gentry. A man like William Compton or Anthony Denny began his career as a minor figure, but through loyal, intimate service in the Privy Chamber, he was elevated to a position of wealth and power that rivaled and often surpassed that of the old nobility. The king used the groom as a tool, a personal agent to bypass the traditional structures of government that were often dominated by the old aristocracy. While the Duke of Norfolk might sit in the Privy Council, convinced of his own importance, the king was in his private closet, formulating policy and dispensing patronage through his Groom of the Stool. This created a new, informal, and intensely personal channel of power that was entirely under the king's control. The rise of the Groom of the Stool was therefore a direct assault on the old feudal order. It was a clear and public signal that the path to power no longer lay through a great castle in the north, but through the back rooms of the palace at Whitehall. The king was recentering the entire political universe on his own household, and the Groom was the planet that orbited closest to the sun. The eventual, slow decline of this powerful office is just as instructive as its spectacular rise, for it charts the course of an even greater political revolution, the birth of the constitutional state and the triumph of Parliament. The story of the 17th century in England is the story of a titanic struggle over the location of sovereignty. The Stuart kings, James I and Charles I, clung to the Tudor model of divine right personal monarchy. But they faced a new and formidable opponent, a House of Commons that was increasingly wealthy, educated, self-confident, and insistent on its own rights and its role in the governance of the realm. This struggle culminated in the cataclysm of the Civil War, the execution of a king, and the establishment of a republic. When the monarchy was restored in 1660, it was a different kind of monarchy. The king was still the head of state, but the principle of parliamentary sovereignty, the idea that the king governed in cooperation with the two houses of parliament, was firmly entrenched. Over the next century, this principle would be solidified by the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the rise of the Hanoverian dynasty. Power was slowly but inexorably migrating out of the king's private chambers and into the public debating chamber of the House of Commons. The figure of the Prime Minister emerged, a chief minister whose power depended not on the king's personal affection, but on his ability to command a majority vote in Parliament. As this fundamental political shift occurred, the very logic that had sustained the power of the Groom of the Stool simply evaporated. His intimacy with the king remained a source of social prestige, but its direct political utility dwindled to almost nothing. It no longer mattered if the groom could persuade the king over a game of cards to favour a particular policy, if the king's ministers knew that policy would be defeated in Parliament. The informal, personal power of the back rooms was being decisively superseded by the formal, institutional power of parliamentary government. The groom's role became increasingly ceremonial, a fossilized remnant of a bygone political ecosystem. It became a prestigious and well-paid sinecure, a title awarded to a great nobleman as a political prize by the prime minister of the day. But its real power was gone. He was no longer a kingmaker, but a placeholder. Finally, the story of the Groom of the Stool forces us to turn the mirror upon ourselves and confront our own deeply ingrained attitudes about the body, privacy, and power. The very fact that we find the title and its duties so shocking, so humorous, and so degrading is a powerful piece of historical evidence in itself. It reveals the immense distance we have traveled in what the sociologist Norbert Elias famously termed the civilizing process. Elias argued that over the past several centuries, Western societies have undergone a profound psychological shift, developing ever lower thresholds of shame and embarrassment surrounding natural bodily functions like eating, sleeping, spitting, and, of course, excreting. We have privatized these acts, pushing them behind an elaborate screen of etiquette, specialized rooms, and deodorized silence. We have created a world where the biological realities of our own existence are things to be managed discreetly and never acknowledged in polite company. The Groom of the Stool comes from a world that existed before this civilizing process was complete, a world that was more frank, more earthy, and far less squeamish about the shared public reality of the human body, even the royal human body. In the Tudor court, the king's body was public property. Its health, its appetites, and its excretions were matters of intense public and political concern. The groom's office was the formal, institutional embodiment of this public ownership of the king's physical self. His decline and disappearance, therefore, also marks the rise of the modern concept of the private individual. The civilizing process not only changed our manners, it changed our politics. By insisting on a zone of privacy around the body, we also implicitly argued that the physical person of the ruler was separate from the abstract office of the head of state. In the final analysis, the man who attended the king on his velvet-upholstered toilet was a figure of profound historical significance. He was the living symbol of a particular kind of power, a particular kind of state, and a particular kind of worldview that has been almost entirely lost to us. He represented a world where intimacy was the ultimate form of power, where personal service to a sacred king was the highest form of honor, and where the king's fragile mortal body was understood to be the mystical vessel of the nation's immortal soul. His spectacular rise in the 16th century charts the course of the fiercely personal, centralized Tudor state. His slow, quiet decline over the course of the 17th and 18th centuries maps the birth of the modern constitutional state and the triumph of impersonal parliamentary institutions. The role is gone now, a relic of a lost world, as alien to us as the surface of another planet. But its story endures as a powerful and unsettling reminder that the grandest political structures are often built on the most intimate of human relationships. It shows us that for all the crowns, the scepters, the thrones, and the theories of divine right, monarchy was, at its very core, a profoundly, inescapably, and often messily human institution. And no one in history knew the profound, vulnerable, and fragile humanity of the king better than the loyal, powerful, and endlessly fascinating figure of the Groom of the Stool. His career was a testament to the fact that in the world of personal monarchy, the greatest secrets of the body politic were often to be found in the most private chambers of the body natural. And so, our journey ends. The firelight of the past, which we have crouched beside for a time, begins to dim. The spectral figures we have watched, the child bride reciting vows she cannot comprehend, the broken king weeping over a coffin, the powerful courtier attending his master's most secret needs, they recede, their faint whispers dissolving back into the great, deep silence of the centuries. We draw the curtain, close the book, and return to our own time, to a world of electric light and silent, glowing screens, a world that feels, after where we have been, both miraculously comfortable and strangely thin. The air here seems different, scrubbed clean of the thick, heavy incense of divine right and the choking dust of dynastic decay. But as we return, let us not do so too quickly. let us pause for a moment on the threshold between their world and ours and consider the echoes that have followed us back. For we have walked through a gallery of the profoundly strange, a series of tableaus that challenge our most basic assumptions about what it means to be human, to love, to rule, and to live. We began with a wedding, an event we associate with personal choice, with romantic love, with the joyous culmination of a private bond. But the world we entered was one where marriage was a grim and public transaction, a piece of human architecture in the construction of a political alliance. We saw a world where a 5-year-old girl was not a child, but a living treaty, her small hand placed in another's to seal a truce or merge a bloodline. We saw a world where the consummation of a marriage was not a private act of intimacy, but a public proof of contract, a state-mandated performance with the fertility of a kingdom hanging in the balance, witnessed, discussed, and prayed for by an entire nation. It was a world that inverted our own, where the private was relentlessly public, and the most profound personal choice was the one thing that was never truly offered. From there, we journeyed to the suffocating heart of a dying empire, into the gilded prison that was the life of King Charles II of Spain. We witnessed not a story of stupidity, but a tragedy of almost Greek proportions, a human catastrophe meticulously engineered by 2 centuries of dynastic pride. We saw a man who was the living embodiment of a genetic cul-de-sac, a king whose very blood was a fatal inheritance. He was a phantom on his own throne, a biological artifact so broken that his people could not explain him through the laws of nature, but only through the language of demons and curses. We stood vigil by his barren marriage beds. We watched the vultures of Europe circle his decaying court, and we descended with him into the final, terrifying darkness of the exorcist's chamber. His story was a chilling testament to the fact that a dynasty, in its obsessive quest to preserve the purity of its own blood, can succeed only in poisoning its own well until all that remains is a single, tragic, and sterile heir, a king who was the end of everything. And finally, we stepped into the most secret of spaces, the royal privy chamber, to understand a role so bizarre it defies modern logic, the groom of the stool. We entered a world where the most menial and physically abject of tasks, attending the king's toilet, was transformed into the highest symbol of trust and the ultimate source of political power. We saw how intimacy became the only currency that mattered, how a whisper in the king's ear in a private moment could outweigh a formal debate in the Council of State. The man who handled the king's bodily waste was no mere servant. He was a gatekeeper, a confidant, a banker, and a chief of staff, a figure of immense influence and terrifying precarity. His story revealed a world where the sacred and the profane were inextricably fused, where the health of the king's body natural was a matter of state, and where proximity to the monarch's inescapable, undignified humanity was the surest and most dangerous path to greatness. What connects these disparate tales? A child bride, a bewitched king, a powerful valet. What is the common thread that runs through these shadowed corridors of the past? It is the profound and unsettling realization that the past is not simply our own time with different clothes and worse sanitation. It is, as the novelist once wrote, a foreign country. They do things differently there. They operate according to a different set of rules, a different understanding of reality itself. To truly understand their world is to recognize that their fundamental assumptions about life, death, God, and the self were profoundly different from our own. Consider their metaphysics. For us, in our largely secularized post-Enlightenment world, God is, for many, a matter of private faith, an abstract belief, a philosophical concept. The devil is a metaphor for our inner darkness. Magic is the stuff of fantasy novels and children's stories. But for the people we have been watching, these were not concepts, they were facts. They were active agents in the daily fabric of life. God was not an idea. He was a kingmaker, a dispenser of victory and plague, a divine judge whose approval was necessary for a legitimate reign. The devil was not a metaphor, he was a real, thinking adversary, a prince of this world who could command legions of demons to possess the bodies of men, even the body of a king. This is not ignorance. It is a different operating system for reality. Understanding this makes the exorcisms of Charles II not a descent into madness, but a desperate and, in their minds, perfectly logical, medical, and spiritual intervention. It makes the endless piety of the Tudor court not just a matter of tradition, but a vital and constant act of spiritual warfare to protect the kingdom. Consider their sociology, their understanding of the individual and society. We are the inheritors of a revolution in thought that has placed the individual at the center of the universe. We believe in individual rights, in self-fulfillment, in the idea that our primary duty is to our own happiness and our own chosen path. This entire framework would have been utterly alien to the people we have observed. For them, the individual did not exist as a separate, autonomous entity, but as a single link in a great, unbreakable chain. You were defined not by your inner self, but by your outer connections, your family, your lineage, your guild, your village, your place in the vast, divinely ordained hierarchy that stretched from the lowest peasant up to the king and from the king up to God. Your duty was not to yourself, but to the preservation of this chain. This explains the child betrothal. The desires of the individual child were a trivial matter when weighed against the dynastic needs of the family, the preservation of the lineage. It explains the power of the groom of the stool, whose honor was derived not from the task itself, but from his specific place in the hierarchy, his proximity to the sacred center. The self was a vessel for duty, not a project for fulfillment. Consider their relationship with the body. We live in a world of profound and ever-increasing bodily privacy. We have created a civilization that seeks to hide, sanitize, and deodorize the inescapable biological realities of our existence. Our bodies are our own private property. But in their world, the king's body was public property. It was a symbol, a text that was to be read and interpreted by all. The king's health was the kingdom's health. His fertility was the kingdom's future. His every physical act was imbued with a ritual significance that we can barely fathom. The birth of a royal heir was not a private family moment. It was a public event, often witnessed by dozens of officials to ensure the legitimacy of the succession. The king dining was a performance of prosperity, and the king defecating, while private, was still a managed, ritualized event of state, overseen by a high-ranking official. This public ownership of the royal body is the soil in which the strange flower of the groom of the stool was able to grow. Their world lacked our squeamishness because it lacked our concept of a truly private, non-political self. So why does it matter? Why do we linger on these strange, dead people and their bizarre, forgotten worlds? We do so not merely for entertainment, not merely to feel a morbid curiosity or a smug sense of our own enlightened progress. We do so because their story is, in a deep and fundamental way, our story. We are their direct descendants, not just in blood, but in culture, in law, and in our subconscious assumptions. Our own world was forged in the fires of their conflicts and built upon the foundations of their ideas. Our modern concept of a companionate marriage based on romantic love is a direct reaction against their model of dynastic transaction. Our belief in a constitutional state, in the separation of powers, is a direct reaction against the absolute personal monarchy that they lived and died under. Our obsession with individual privacy is a direct reaction against their world of radical publicity. We cannot understand our own values without first understanding the world against which those values define themselves. They are the dark matter of our own society, the invisible history that shaped the contours of our present. To study their world is also to be humbled. It is to recognize that the things we hold to be self-evident, the primacy of the individual, the pursuit of happiness, the truth of scientific materialism, are not timeless universal laws. They are ideas. They are themselves historical artifacts, the products of a particular time and place. And it is entirely possible that future generations, looking back from their own distant vantage point, will find our own deeply held beliefs and customs to be just as strange, just as illogical, and just as bizarre as we find the world of the groom of the stool. History teaches us a profound intellectual humility. It frees us from the tyranny of the present, the arrogant assumption that our way of seeing the world is the only way or the best way. It reminds us that we too are simply a chapter in a much longer story. And yet, for all the vast, unbridgeable differences, for all the foreignness of their world, the final, lingering echo is one of a shared and recognizable humanity. Beneath the strange customs and the alien beliefs, we see emotions that we know in our own hearts. We see the ambition of the courtier, the despair of the young bride being sent to a foreign land, the grief of a king for his lost love. We see the terror of a man facing the executioner's axe, the physical pain of a body racked with illness, and the deep human need for companionship and trust. Henry VIII's paranoia, Charles VI's profound suffering, the quiet loyalty of a servant, the calculated cruelty of a minister, these are not historical artifacts. They are the timeless, unchanging threads of the human condition, woven into a tapestry so different from our own, yet made of the very same raw material. We look into the strange mirror of the past and see, reflected dimly, our own faces. So let us now let the silence settle. The stories have been told, the journey is complete, but the past is never truly over. It does not lie dormant in old books and dusty ruins. It is alive. It is a constant, low hum beneath the noise of our own time. It is in the language we speak, the laws we obey, the institutions we inhabit, the very shape of our thoughts. If you listen carefully, in the quietest moments you can still hear the echoes. You can hear the rustle of a silk gown in a cold stone corridor, the distant mournful cry of a forgotten king, and the faint conspiratorial whisper of a secret being shared in the king's most private chamber. History is not the story of what is dead, it is the story of what has not yet finished happening, and it is always, always waiting to be listened to. Thank you for joining me, and good night.